Hi everyone, thank you for being here with us tonight. Just give me a presentation up here. So as Ms. Hess mentioned, my name is Cecilia Gamboa. I'm a counselor at the Children's Bereavement Center. And tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about talking to children about illness and death. So I like to start by just acknowledging that we are all in a global pandemic together. We're all going through a lot of things that are very similar. We're all encountering familiar events in one another's lives. But I like the saying, it says we're in the same storm, but not in the same boat. So, although what we're going to talk about tonight is going to be very familiar and it's going to be far reaching across those of us who are in the presentation, I do want to point out and acknowledge that we're not all in the same boat. And so, we may respond differently to the events that are occurring around us. We may have different resources that allow us to overcome. And we'll talk about some of those during our presentation today. So the goals of this presentation are going to be to learn how grief and anxiety impact children, to learn how to talk to children about illness and death, and to learn how to support grieving or anxious children. So I always like to start with a very simple definition of grief and bereavement. We are known as the Bereavement Center, and the reason is because we serve children and their families who have experienced a death loss. And so if you see here, bereavement is the separation from a loved one by death. And it comes from the Old English word that means to take, to seize, or to remove. And so the occurrence of bereavement is very literally that removal of a loved person from your life by death. The grief process is the combination of our physiological, emotional, spiritual, and behavioral reactions to the loss. So while members of a family may all be experiencing bereavement because of the death of a loved one, their grief experience may be different. We know that grief is universal and normal. All of us experience death in our lifetime. And the responses, although they feel really uncomfortable, are a really normal reaction to those losses. We do know that grief is different for each individual because it's a combination of the physical, emotional, behavioral, and spiritual. Every person's combination of a grief expression may look a little bit different, even within the same household or the same family. We also know that grief varies across developmental stages. Very young children, 6 or 7 and younger, their understanding of grief is very different from, say, a 12 or a 13-year-old. And so, what we see sometimes is if a very young child has experienced a death loss, we may intervene, we may give them support and see them doing okay. And then we may see them re grieve again at a later age when they get a little older and understand things differently. So, how long does it take people to grieve? We know that there is an acute grief mourning stage. What that is that's that time frame immediately after a death loss has occurred. It's typically about 4 weeks. During this time, the emotions that we feel, the reactions that we have may be really strong. And so during this acute mourning stage is when we are feeling the loss, and we're feeling the missing of our person, and we're having a hard time sleeping, and we may not want to think about them or remember them. All of those behaviors are very normal during this acute grief stage, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in a little while. We do know that grief is adaptive, and so with the passage of time, the grief responses begin to decrease. We start to feel a little better. We are able to remember our person for the positive things that happened and happy memories, as opposed to remembering really sad things. We do know that grief is not cured. There's not a magic button that means we're never going to miss our person ever again, but it is integrated. And so we learn to live, we learn to keep living without that person in our life. So, when we're talking about grief and what it looks like in children, and for yourselves as caregivers, and how do we recognize this in children, what I've noted here is distress, because distress is a big umbrella and can pretty much mean any emotion that makes us feel uncomfortable or is hard to manage. So we know with children that distress tends to be expressed through their behavior. Oftentimes, children, especially very young children, may not have the words to describe or express how they feel. They may be confused by the experiences that they're having. They may be confused by the behavior or the emotions that they're seeing other people in their families express. And so we tend to see it come out with their behavior. Sometimes this behavior is an increase in maladaptive behaviors, which are unhelpful behaviors like having tantrums, running away, or we may see behavioral changes as a decrease in adaptive behaviors or behaviors that are helpful, things that help them feel better. And sometimes it's both. We know that each child's response to distress is unique. And so, again, even within the same household, you may have children who are responding in different ways to the death loss. When we're addressing children's behavior and trying to figure out what might be a symptom of grief, what I always encourage caregivers is you know your child best. You know how they were functioning before grief. You know if there were behaviors that were there before the death loss happened. And so when we're monitoring children and paying attention to their distress levels to see if there's a change, these are some things we might notice. Okay. So we may see an increase in behavior such as crying, or refusing to cry. If this child was a child who previously cried a lot and now they're working really hard to hold it in and be strong, that may be a changed behavior, right? Or children before who tended to be pretty happy go lucky, pretty easygoing. Maybe now we see them crying a lot more or being triggered to cry more easily, right? We may see kids get very hyperactive, which can feel confusing when we're grieving, and maybe we don't feel that way. But sometimes children, when they feel anxious or distressed, they may talk really fast. They may have trouble settling and sitting down. So you may see them wandering around, having trouble staying at their desk at school. You may see increased yelling, pushing, throwing, or hitting. So, just some of the, again, those behaviors that we tend to see when kids are stressed or having a hard time. You may see an increase in tantrums or children refusing to follow the rules. And for particularly for older kiddos, you may see them wanting to take on adult responsibilities or adult worries. We see this a lot when the person who is ill or the person who has died was one of the caregivers in the home, somebody maybe who worked and helped pay the bills. Oftentimes we'll see older children feel like that is their responsibility now, and so they have to begin to help the other parent earn money to pay household bills, or they feel like they need to stay home and take care of their siblings. Sometimes we see decreased behavior. And so we may see kids who previously talked about their emotions or were easily able to show you how they felt. Now they're refusing to cry and refusing to talk about it. We may see kids withdraw or isolate, which means that they turn into themselves. They don't share how they're feeling with others. Maybe if you've had pretty easy communication with your child in the past, you may notice that they're no longer communicating. You may see kids trying to avoid conflict, and again, by keeping their emotions hidden. If the topic of the person who has died comes up, or if there's tension about something that's related to the death, you may see them avoid that conflict, shut down. They may leave the room altogether. Sometimes we see kids feeling like they have to be perfect, or they feel like they have to act. We see them acting too good, which they're not wanting to get in trouble. Maybe their behavior has completely changed, and from the outside, it can look like a positive change because they're no longer getting called on by the teacher, or you're not getting notes sent home from school. But sometimes that's their response to the grief because they're so afraid of upsetting other people around them, right? And then sometimes we see regressive behavior. So maybe a 5-year-old who's been potty trained for a couple of years may begin to wet the bed when they have nightmares. Or a 10-year-old who's been sleeping in their own bed for several years may suddenly want to be sleeping in their caregiver's bed, and they may be afraid to sleep alone. So COVID-19 has definitely had an impact on our grief. We know that grief is our like we talked about, physical, emotional, spiritual, and physiological response to loss. We acknowledge that grief loss is not always a death, right? With the pandemic, we've lost access to our friends. We've lost access to family members who live outside of the home. For students who are transitioning or going to school, they've lost access to things like proms or graduations, celebrations that were important. Even loss to access of things like sports, playing in band, right? Participating in those extracurricular activities that for children may have been really important prior to the pandemic. And so just acknowledging that the impact that the pandemic has had on us on a global scale has resulted in grief apart from death loss. So when we start to talk to children about illness, we know with COVID, lots of families have been touched by the illness. And so in figuring out how do I inform my child of what's going on, how do I let them know without overwhelming them or making them feel afraid, there are a few key steps we can take to make sure that we're keeping them in the loop. They feel like they know what to expect, but we're not giving too much information. So first and foremost, we always want to answer their questions honestly. This goes for if we're speaking to them about COVID or any other illness. If you have a loved one who has cancer or diabetes or has been put in the hospital for another diagnosis, we always want to speak to children honestly and let them know what's happening. We let the child lead. And so for older children, you may hear them asking more questions. They may really want to know what's going on, how they can help. For very little children, they may just need short, brief sentences, just letting them know, you know what, grandpa's in the hospital, but the doctors are taking really good care of him. And that may be all they need. We do want to keep it short and adjust what we're telling them to their developmental age. We don't want to give too many details, even if they're older children. We want to really just give them a basic understanding of what's happening and give them information about what the illness is. And so, if they have a loved one who is in the hospital with COVID, we do want to talk to them about some of the symptoms that person may be experiencing so that they have an understanding, right? They're in the hospital, they needed help breathing, but the doctors are giving them the medicine that they need. And that can be really satisfactory for a child because they just want to know something's being done to help my person, right? We want to differentiate between a child's experience and a grown-up's experience. If we know that a grandparent or a loved one has cancer and they're in the hospital because it's lung cancer and they're having trouble breathing, and then your child gets a cold and they're having respiratory symptoms and they're having trouble breathing, they may get really scared because they may make that connection of when my person had a hard time breathing, they had to go to the hospital and now I'm having a hard time breathing. Or when my person started coughing, they had to go to the hospital and now I'm coughing. And so if you know there's a difference if your child has a cold, but they have a loved one who had similar symptoms that landed them in the hospital, help your child understand that difference so that they can know that what's happening to their body is not the same as what happened to the person who ended up in the hospital, right? We do answer honestly, but it's also okay to say, I don't know. There may be questions they ask you about the illness, or sometimes when our loved ones are in the hospital, we're not sure what the outcome is going to be. We're not sure when they're going to get to come home. We're not sure when they're going to get released. And so in those cases, it is okay to say, I don't know the answer, but we'll talk about it again when I find out, right? And then we always want to give children choices. And so if you are going to visit a loved one in the hospital and the child is allowed to visit, or if you're doing a virtual visit via Zoom or some kind of video platform, it's good to let the child choose whether or not they want to be part of that visit. Now, when we're talking to children about death, the circumstances are very similar. So we want to speak honestly and use age appropriate language. We want to use clear language like dead and died. Right now, it feels very taboo in our culture to say the words dead and died. It can feel like you're going to hurt your child or you're going to cause them extra stress. But what we know, especially with very young children, is when we say things like the person went to sleep or we lost our person, that can be really confusing for a young child because they don't understand what death, what that means in regards to the death. Again, for 7 and under, they may not understand that death is permanent. They may believe that their person can come back to visit, or that if they pray or wish hard enough, that they can see their person again. So when we're explaining to a child that somebody has died, we want to try to use those clear language. For very little ones, a phrase that we use at the center is to help them understand is telling them that the person's body stopped working. And that's a concrete way of helping them understand that because their body doesn't work anymore, they're no longer here. We're not able to see them now. Again, we want to let the child lead. Children can only carry small amounts of information at a time. It takes them a minute to understand it, to digest it, and then to be able to lead with follow-up questions. And so if you give your child a small amount of information and they're okay with that, it's okay to let them sit with that for a little while. We want to try to give them the space to ask questions without giving them so much information that they become overwhelmed. Again, it's okay to say, I don't know. It's definitely okay to share your spiritual beliefs about death. A lot of times, this is something as family members and caregivers, if we're raising young children and we have our own spiritual beliefs, we share them with the children anyway. But even if it's not a conversation you've not had before, when we have a loved one who has died, that's a wonderful time to have that conversation with your child because it can give them an expectation of maybe what's on the other side, what's happening to my person now that they're not here with me anymore, right? Um, it's okay to cry when you need to. This is something we hear from a lot of parents and caregivers that they worry that if they cry or get sad in front of the child, that they're going to make them upset. And they feel the need to protect the child from those emotions. But what we know is that children learn about safety and they learn their sense of the world from watching us. And so if we're sad, it is okay to cry. It is okay to let them know I'm really sad because I miss our person and I probably need to take a break or I need to step outside, right? But it is okay to show them that grief. And finally, with death, we do again encourage choices for the children. If you're not sure whether the child would want to go to the funeral or a viewing or a rosary or a memorial service, talk to them about it and let them be your guide as far as what would work for them. So, phrases and actions we want to try to avoid when we're talking to our children about illness and death are we want to try to avoid playing it down. Children are very perceptive and really able to recognize when something's going on with us. We've evolved that way. Children are able to read their caregivers and understand when something's going on, even if the caregivers don't say so. And the reason for that is because children depend on us for survival. And so if we're distressed, if we're exhibiting symptoms, but we're not telling them what's going on, oftentimes children will invent their own explanation. And sometimes those explanations can be more scary or completely inaccurate than what's really happening. And so being honest, letting them know what's happening really is the best policy. Now, that being said, again, we want to avoid providing too many details. We don't want to provide details that are very distressing, very gory details, if it's details of a death loss or an illness that's really taken a toll. We just want to give them just enough information so they know what's happening without giving them the details about how or what is happening. Okay. We want to try to avoid blame, especially right now in the time of COVID. There's a lot of stigma around the illness. And so we want to try to avoid blaming people for getting sick or, excuse me, or blaming others for causing that person to get sick because we don't want to add that additional anxiety to the child where they feel like, okay, now do I have to be mad at that person? Or is it going to be my fault if I get sick, right? So we want to try to avoid blame. We want to try to avoid panic. And so, again, COVID is really scary. We're hearing on the news all the time that things are getting worse or that numbers are going up. And so all of that feeds into our sense of anxiety as the caregiver. We want to try to do our best to manage that anxiety so that we're not panicking and then transmitting that to the child. Because again, they know when we're distressed, they know when something's wrong with us. And so if we begin to panic, we pass that to them, right? And then finally, we don't want to force children to talk about a death loss or an illness. We really want to let them take the lead. It's okay to bring it up, to say, hey, our loved one has been in the hospital for a few days. Do you want to talk about it? Do you have any questions? And if they say no, or, I'm okay right now, then it's okay to trust their lead and trust that they're okay. What we don't want to do is say, no, you have to talk to me about it. Tell me how you're feeling. Tell me what you were thinking about. Because that may cause them to close themselves off from you, or it may increase their distress because they're feeling forced to talk about something that makes them uncomfortable. When we're talking about death, especially with young children, like I mentioned before, we do want to avoid using metaphors like lost or sleeping, because very young children, are very literal. And so if we say our loved one is sleeping, then this child may start to believe that, well, what's going to happen to me when I go to sleep? Am I going to wake up, or am I going to be gone forever like our person, right? Um, we want to try to avoid hiding our feelings or our grief response. Again, when we can model those and show that to our children, we're teaching them that it is okay to grieve, that it is okay to feel sad and miss our person. We want to avoid telling them to be strong or be brave. I think this is a really common occurrence for caregivers, because we want our children to be able to overcome. But when we tell them be strong or be brave when it's a grief loss, then the message they may be receiving is, it's not okay for me to be afraid, or I can't talk about this because then I don't look strong, right? And we want to make sure that we're inviting that conversation, we're allowing them the space to talk. And so trying to avoid these phrases can be helpful in inviting them to be open with us. And then finally, we want to try to avoid getting upset if our children don't react the way we do. Children do grieve a little differently. As I mentioned before, they can only handle small chunks of information at a time. And this high level of distress, they can only carry it for a short amount of time. And so they may be playing and laughing and being silly when we feel sad, when we're grieving. And so trying to not take that personal, because their grief is going to look different from yours. I love the saying, when we are caregivers and we're trying to figure out how to support our children, we need to be the thermostat, not the thermometer, right? And so, what the thermostat does is the thermostat controls the temperature of the room. And so, if things are getting really heated, right? If there's a lot of distress, if there's, whether it's anger or sadness or frustration, when we're the thermostat, we want to try to bring that down to a more manageable level, right? Where when we're the thermometer, we're reacting to that same temperature. We're meeting them right where they're at. And so, as caregivers, our goal is to try to be that thermostat and control the temperature in the room. When children are coping with distress, when they're dealing with things like grief and illness that can be very confusing and overwhelming, we do know that they make sense of that through play. And so, getting outside, playing with their dolls. You may see them playing doctor and taking care of their stuffed animals or their action figures, their Barbies. These kinds of things are normal. Children use play and oftentimes mimic what they see or hear from adults as a way of trying to make sense of what's going on. They do need breaks from hard and scary topics, just like we talked about. If you imagine carrying this backpack full of rocks, for very little children, that can be exhausting, it can be overwhelming. Sometimes they have to set that down so that they can rest and recharge. Oftentimes, as adults, we tend to get stuck, and things like that, it lasts longer for us. We might spend the whole day thinking about how sad we feel or how much we miss our person. Children require consistency, and routines equal safety. And so, with our children, if we can keep up the same routines and expectations that we held prior to the death loss or the hospitalization or illness of a loved one, what that shows our children is, even though these really scary things are happening, the world can still make sense. We still go to bed at the same time. We still eat dinner together. We still brush our teeth and read a book before bedtime, right? Those little routines and consistency can really go a long way in helping a child feel safe. And then I love this last one. The most powerful tool you can give your child is to reassure them that they are safe and cared for. You, as caregivers, are the most important coping tool that your child has. Because again, when you're that thermostat, when you tell them, I love you and you're accepted and you're supported and it's okay to feel the way that you feel, that work that you do with them will heal them in ways that counseling may not ever touch, right? Just being there and being that safe space for them and knowing that they have somewhere safe to land is the most important thing for your child. So, how adolescents cope looks a little different from young children, but the point I always like to make is that adolescents are children too. And so sometimes when our kids get into middle school or they get into high school, we may assume that, you know what, they're old enough to tell us how they feel. They're pretty good at, they bathe themselves, they may cook for themselves, they may get themselves up in the morning and get ready for school on their own. And so we assume that they're independent, that they may not need us as much for that emotional guidance or that support the way young children do. But the reality is that adolescents are still children. And even up until they're young adults, they still need reassurance from parents. They may still need help identifying their emotions, solving problems. And so, you know, taking the time to create that space for your older kids as well. Play looks different for them. It's still very important. For adolescents, play may look like connecting with their friends on Xbox. It may look like participating in those extracurricular things like marching band or dance or football. And so play may look a little different, but it serves the same purpose. It's a way for adolescents to work through those really strong or confusing emotions and have something positive that can refuel them. They need time with healthy peers. So as teenagers are growing up, they are trying to separate from us a little bit and figure out who they are as an individual. So we do see them spending more time with peers, and that's normal and developmentally appropriate. We do encourage time with healthy peers because, of course, if they're friends with somebody who's, inviting them to make unhealthy choices, then that's a different conversation. They need to know that you're available. Again, teenagers may not always want to talk. And when you invite them to talk or you say, hey, are you okay? How are you feeling about this? They may say, I'm fine. I don't want to talk about it. And so they won't always share with you. But as long as you're offering and saying, I'm here if you need to talk, I'm here if you need anything. I noticed today you look a little down. I'm here if you need me. And just constantly giving them that message that you're available, it goes a long way for them because even if they don't talk to you, they know that you're there and that they can depend on you. And then this last one is very similar to the one on the previous slide, that support and validation from loved ones are extremely effective. And so if just recognizing, hey, you look a little down today. I know that today was our person's birthday and I'm missing them too. Just saying something like that helps your child feel understood and feel seen, even if they don't say anything back to you. So, what are ways as caregivers that we can help support our children? First, we want to try to identify what's in control. This is for our children and for us. One helpful way we can do this is try to make a list. There are things that are within our control, like safety things, putting on our seatbelt, wearing our mask, washing our hands. And there are things that are outside of our control, like if other people wear masks or um, the numbers that are going up and down, right? And so try to identify with your child what is in your control, and then you can create a clear plan about how we can address this, right? Talking to children, especially really little children, about a clear safety plan. If a child is experiencing fear because a loved one is in the hospital or a loved one has died, talk to your child about this is the plan that we have to try to make sure we're safe, right? And to increase our chances of staying safe, staying healthy. We want to try to limit exposure to news alerts and broadcast. I say try to limit because, again, we know with some children having their own cell phones, we don't always have control of what they see every single day. but as much as possible, trying to limit, especially with very little children. Oftentimes, they may be playing and distracted in the living room, and we don't think they're paying attention, but they may hear the news story that's on the TV, or they may hear your conversation that you're having on the phone. And so, even when we think they're not paying attention, oftentimes they are hearing us, right? And then we want to allow questions. Children are going to have a lot of questions. Very small children will ask the same question over and over. This can be really frustrating for a caregiver, especially again if you're grieving or you're going through your own stress because someone is ill. Find people who can help you answer some of those questions or who you can redirect them to, because it is normal for them to ask that same question over and over because, again, they're trying to make sense of what has happened. We definitely, one of the best things we can do as caregivers is help our children name their feelings. Like I mentioned at the beginning, oftentimes children feel distress, they feel it in their bodies. They may feel it in their heart racing or their stomach hurting or headaches, but they may not have the words to express what that is, right? And so when you see them struggling, but they don't have the words, it's okay to wonder. We wonder a lot as counselors. I wonder if you're feeling a little anxious. I notice that your leg is fidgeting, right? Or, I know that today is a special day at school and your person's not able to be there with you. I wonder how you feel about that. I wonder if maybe you're sad. And so naming those feelings, putting those suggestions out there. The wonderful things about kids is they're going to let you know whether you're right or wrong. And so either way, it invites that conversation. It helps them learn what their feelings are. Try to create new coping skills. Not every coping skill is going to work for every emotion. And so if you have a child who's very anxious, doing deep breaths might be really helpful for them. But when they're very angry, deep breaths may not help. They may not want to do that, right? And so trying different coping skills. And coping skills really can be anything that is an interest to your child. Oftentimes, when we think of coping skills, we imagine things that you learn in counseling, things that have to be very structured or very routine. But something as simple as jumping on the trampoline can be a coping skill. Taking a bubble bath can be a coping skill, having a dance party. And so try new things with your children. And then also know that different children may need different coping skills. So what works for one may not work for the other. Get creative. Again, coping skills can be anything that you can imagine: going for a walk, playing with a dog, reading a book, putting on music. It really is adaptable to what your needs are. Again, let them know you're available, and then play. We can play with our children. It doesn't have to be an hour a day. If you can give them 5 or 10 minutes where y'all draw a picture together, where you're racing to put away toys, where you're um, creating something together, baking cookies, making cupcakes, anything like that. When we're going for walks together, going for we have a counselor who has a wonderful intervention she loves to do where there are treasure hunts, and the family is invited to go on walks and try to collect little pieces of treasure. And then when they come home, they talk about their treasure. And treasure can be a bird feather, it can be a special looking rock, it can be a pretty flower that they found. And so when we're exploring these coping skills with our children, it doesn't have to be expensive. It doesn't have to cost money. If we're not able to get out of our home because of social distancing or because of our schedule, there's a lot that we can do within our power at home. Again, we want to try to avoid exposing children to really adult concerns. We know with a pandemic, there's been a lot of economic hardship. There is financial uncertainty. People are worried about paying the rent. They're worried about how they're going to buy groceries. They're worried about affording gas or affording their phone bill, their internet. And so these are very real concerns. But as much as we can, we want to try to avoid sharing those concerns with our children. Again, because very little children may get anxious about it because there's nothing they can do. And teenagers may feel burdened by it. They may feel like I have to do something to help. And that's a lot of responsibility for a teenager. We want to try to avoid making promises we can't keep. This goes back to the point I made about if you don't know the answer to a question, it is okay to say, I don't know. Because if your child says, when is our person going to come home from the hospital? And you tell them they'll be home soon. I know that, I promise they're going to be home soon. And we don't know, we may be setting that child up for disappointment because they're expecting that somebody's going to come home and we may not know the outcome, right? So try to avoid making promises if it's not something that we know for sure. We don't want to depend on our children to make us feel better. That's just human nature to look for things that make us feel better. And for parents and caregivers, sometimes our joy does come from our children, right? From our little ones. And so there's nothing wrong with finding joy in your children. And if coming home to your children is what makes you feel recharged and what makes you feel grounded again, then 100% we encourage that. When I say don't depend on them to help you feel better, what I mean is if you're having a really difficult time and you are expecting your interaction with them to remove the grief or to remove the stress, um, that's a lot of expectation to have of our children, right? And so finding space for yourself to get support, people that you can talk to when you are having a hard time and you need that support for yourself. And then lastly, we want to try to avoid distracting or changing the subject when hard topics come up or hard feelings. This is an intervention we learn early on when our children are toddlers, right? If they're upset, if they're having a tantrum, if they're fighting for a toy with a sibling, sometimes we'll distract them. We'll say, hey, look over here. Why don't you play with this? Or you know what, let's go outside, and we'll try to divert their attention to get away from that temper tantrum or to avoid a temper tantrum. But when children have questions about grief, when they're talking to you about being worried about somebody who's sick, if we distract in that moment or we change the subject, the message our children may receive is that this is not okay to talk about. When I ask these questions, it makes my parents or my caregivers uncomfortable. So as much as we can, we want to try to hold that space and be there with them when they have those difficult emotions or those difficult questions. And holding space, being there for them can be something as simple as just sitting and listening with them, right? Offering a hug, for children who don't like hugs. Again, just offering time where y'all can sit, inviting them to go for a walk with you so that you can talk about things in private. Those are all really wonderful options for sitting in that space with them, and helping them process through that difficult emotion. So once we have a loved one who has died or a loved one who has been hospitalized, we know that that creates changes in the dynamics at home. It creates changes for you as the caregiver as far as what your child is expressing and how we're caring for them. And so what we do want to encourage is, if as much as possible, trying to keep those routines the same. So again, going back to what we discussed earlier, that consistency and routines for children equal safety. I know what comes next. This world might be really scary and I may not understand what's going on with my person who's in the hospital, but I know that after dinner we do bedtime, or after bath we read a book, and that feels safe for them. So as much as possible, trying to keep routines the same. When there are going to be changes in routines. So, for example, if you have to go stay the night at the hospital with a loved one and your children aren't able to go, we want to try to prepare them for that and explain to them as much as we can so that they do know, they are prepared that something different is going to happen this time. We recognize that sometimes with a death loss, there are big changes. We may have to change schools, we may have to move homes, we may have to change neighborhoods. And so, in those cases, just talking to your children and preparing them about what's going to happen can go a long way in easing some of the anxiety. Take time to reassure your children. Again, this is even true with teenagers, that if you see them, um, you know them best. And so if you see that their behavior is different, if you see them doing things that cause you to believe that they might be upset, they may be anxious, they may be sad, they may be angry, reassure them. It's okay to say, hey, this is what I'm noticing. Do you need a hug? Do you want to talk? And give them that space to comfort them, right? If you know that their behavior has changed in a way that's going to affect their performance at school, whether it's their behavior or their grades, go ahead and let the school know. share as much information as you're comfortable with. You don't have to give details, but giving the teacher a heads up and saying, hey, this is something that happened in our life, that can help the teacher have an understanding of why your child may be behaving differently, right? And then again, we always encourage you to be patient as children grow and re-experience grief, because a child who experiences grief at 5 may experience it again at 10. They may experience it again at 13. They may experience it again at 18. And the reason is because every time they pass through a different developmental stage, their understanding of that illness or the grief response might grow, might be a little bit different from before. When we're helping them remember their deceased, if we have a loved one who dies, really fun ways to keep them as part of our life, to continue that um, connection that we have with our loved one. A neat way to do that is to memorialize them, whether it's through telling stories, looking at photo books, um, watching videos of things that y'all used to do together, making memory boxes. Those are ways that we can share positive memories that can start to replace some of the sad or the hard things that have happened since our person died. Now, remember, we mentioned the acute grief phase. And so memorializing our person may not feel comfortable right at the beginning. This may be something that comes a little later after we're all feeling like we can adjust a little bit. We can recreate or make new family rituals. This is especially true with birthdays, holidays, anniversaries. There may be things that we used to do every summer, and this summer they're not going to look the same. And so we can recreate those rituals by doing something different, or adapting what we did before. Or we can create totally new family rituals that have nothing to do with something we've done before. Most of all, we want to have fun with it. We're going to miss our person and we're going to feel sad, but we may also remember funny things that they did, silly things that they said, inside jokes that they had with the kids. And so it's okay to remember those things and to laugh. And then it's okay to talk about our deceased loved ones, even if it does make you cry, because again, you're modeling what appropriate grief looks like, and you're giving your children permission to discuss when they miss their person as well. So I always like to put this piece in here when we're talking to caregivers, that it's so important to take care of yourself as well. We can't pour from an empty cup, right? If we are not recharging ourselves, if we're not allowing ourselves that time to rest, then we're not going to have energy to take care of our children. It's going to be a lot harder to give that support because we're going to be tired, we're going to be frustrated. And so making sure that as much as you can, you're finding space for yourself as well. Even if it's 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there. Again, self-care, just like coping skills, doesn't have to mean it's an hour of yoga that I do every day or a weekend retreat. It can look like that, but it doesn't have to. It can be little pockets of moments where maybe I just sit outside and drink my coffee while it's still hot. Or after the children go to bed, I get to take a hot shower by myself uninterrupted, right? Those little things can be self-care too. With self-care, we want to remember that if a death has occurred and your children are grieving, then more than likely you're grieving too. And so you want to respect your own grief process and the needs that you have and find help if you need it. If you do need a break, see if there are people in your circle who you trust, who are safe, that could give you a break. Again, even if it's just to go grab lunch and eat in silence. It doesn't have to be for a long period of time, but it is okay to ask for help. We're all going through this really hard time together. Give yourself grace as you adjust to a new life. This is especially true with caregivers like grandparents or aunts and uncles who are having to raise children because maybe the parent has died. Or if we have a parent who's now a single parent because their partner is the one who died, there is going to be an adjustment. We're going to have to adapt to the roles that have changed, because maybe now I don't have somebody to help me make dinner while I help with homework, or I don't have somebody to pick up the kids while I get home from work. And so as you're adjusting to those changes, then give yourself grace and permission to know that maybe the house isn't going to be clean all the time. We may not have a perfectly home cooked meal every night, and those things really are okay. It's about finding the balance that works for you and your family, right? And then allowing yourself time to heal. I hear so many times from parents who tell me, my children, they're laughing, they're back in school, they seem to be doing okay. Why am I still having such a hard time? And it's for a couple of reasons. Again, because with adults, those things stick with us a little longer because we don't take play breaks the way that kids do. But also because oftentimes as caregivers, we're putting our children's needs first, and so we don't always allow ourselves that time to process. And so every person's time frame is going to be unique. Allow yourself the time that you need to heal, and know that it may not look like what your children's time frame look like. It may be shorter, may be longer. So when do we look for red flags? What we know is that grief timeline varies from person to person. And so how I'm feeling 3 months after my death loss may be different from how you're feeling 3 months after your death loss. We know that high levels of distress are very normal in that acute stage of grief. And so things, again, like crying frequently, not being able to concentrate, not wanting to eat, having difficulty sleeping, feeling foggy, like we can't concentrate or focus on our work. All of those things are very normal and expected when we're in that acute grief stage. And so what may look like red flags to other people may be perfectly normal for what you're going through at that time. We do know that counseling is typically not effective during that grief stage because our bodies are in shock from that death loss. Our brain is not able to absorb new information because we're feeling foggy headed, having difficulty concentrating. We may have difficulty sleeping. And so during that acute phase, what we recommend to families is really leaning on your support. What people and children need most when we lose somebody important to us is to be surrounded by people who we know and people who love us and know how to support us. One of the things that we hear from parents reported that can be worrisome is reunification fantasies. Sometimes we'll hear children say things like, I want to go to heaven so I can see my person. Or, I wish my person could come back. I wish they could come back and see me. And so, reunification fantasies, talking about I want to die to be with my person, is very different from a suicidal ideation. Reunification fantasies are normal and expected, especially with smaller children who may not understand that death is permanent. And they may think, all I have to do is die, and I can see my person who I miss so much, right? And so, although those sound scary, they're not unexpected with death. Versus suicidal ideations where children are saying, I want to die, I want to kill myself, I know how I would do it. And it's not so much to be with their person, but there is that intent to die. And so this can be confusing, it can be scary. If you have concerns about your child, please check in with their school counselor, with a mental health professional, with your doctor, because it is okay to ask for help and to try to get clarification to tell the difference. If we see children experiencing significant depressive symptoms, so again, crying a lot, being very tearful, very emotional, losing motivation to do things, these things are really normal in that acute grief stage, and they are expected. However, if after a significant amount of time we start to see maybe that things are not improving, things are getting worse, maybe they're getting stuck and it's been 6, 7, 8 months since the death loss, that may be a reason to get them evaluated and talk to a mental health professional. Avoidance and refusing to talk about the death, again, very normal in the acute grief stage. After a few months, if this avoidance is still very strong and they're still refusing to acknowledge the death, you may talk to a counselor, a mental health professional, or a doctor. If your child seems numb or they seem to be in another world, they're daydreaming, um, especially when the topic of death comes up, again, very normal in the acute stage at the beginning of our grief journey. But if after months, this is still something that you're seeing very strongly, they're not able to focus, to complete their schoolwork, they're zoning out during conversations at the table, then it is okay to talk to a mental health professional or counselor, and maybe get them have them talk to somebody to see if there's something else going on. And then if children can't stop talking or thinking about the person or how they died, again, in the acute grief stage, and especially for very young children, this is really normal. They're going to ask a lot of questions, and they're going to bring it up, and they're going to tell their classmates, and they're going to talk to you, and they're going to tell friends and strangers on the street, because they're trying to make sense of what happened. But if months have gone by and you see that they're still not able to stop talking about it, or they become very upset when they're talking about it and they're not able to stop, then that's a good time to see about talking to a counselor. Okay. Again, if you see them unable to complete daily tasks at the beginning, this is very normal. We expect that they're going to have trouble sleeping, getting homework done. They may be moody and not want to help around the house, do things that they used to do. But if it's been months and you see that this has not improved a little bit, or it's getting worse, they may need to see a counselor. If they, anytime they're engaging in dangerous or risk-taking behavior, that's a good time to talk to a counselor, whether it be a school counselor, a personal counselor, somebody at your church that does counseling or spiritual counseling. Those kinds of things are can be normal for teenagers and teenage behavior. Some of the risk-taking stuff, like driving very fast, experimenting with alcohol. But if it gets to be something that is persistent, that they're doing a lot, that it's increasing, that you're really worried about their safety, they may need to talk to a counselor. And then finally, anytime your child says, I want to kill myself, I want to die, I have a plan, this is what I'm going to do, we always want to get crisis help, whether that's going to your nearest emergency room, calling the crisis hotline, calling 911. We want to take those disclosures seriously when they come from our children, or from an adult. And then if you see that children are cutting or talking about wanting to cut or hurt themselves, again, it's good to talk to either their doctor or school counselor, mental health counselor. So finally, if you find that you all need grief support, you're welcome to call our center. We're located at 205 West Olmos. We are under construction right now because we're expanding, and so that's really exciting. Currently, our services, our support groups are offered virtually because of COVID and social distancing. Um, but anytime that your family is in need of services, if you want to learn more, you can call the number on the screen here and select the option for new clients. Okay. These are just some resources where you can find additional information about grief. You can find videos and articles to help you talk to your children about grief. And again, my name is Cecilia Gamboa. Thank you so much for tuning in tonight. Have a good night.